The gorge appears first, wide, black, a wound in the earth so deep the bottom holds its own weather fog that never fully burns off cold, that stays even in July silence, that has a texture to it, the way silence does in places where something enormous once happened, and the land hasn't forgotten. Then the bridge. Iron, 90 meters of it, red and rust and 100 years of standing over nothing. 3 stories of riveted truss rising from the rock walls like something that grew there, like something that decided to stay. A figure on the deck, moving, not fast, deliberate. The way men move when they know exactly where to put their weight. A dog beside him, white masked, one eye the color of ice, one the color of creek water, both watching the dark below. The river is rising, 40 meters down. The iron is shaking, and the man reaches into his jacket, pulls out a rope, doesn't look down, starts moving toward the other side. The bridge appeared before the town did. That was the thing Cole Hargrove noticed first. Not the gas station, not the grain elevator poking up through the tree line, not the hand-painted sign that said, "Welcome to Duskfield Pop." 1847 with the 7 scratched out and a 3 painted over it in different colored paint, like the town couldn't decide whether to be honest or hopeful. No, the bridge. It rose out of the morning fog like something that hadn't decided yet whether to be a ruin or a monument. 3 stories of riveted iron truss, black and red and orange, stretching 90 meters across the gorge, like a fist that refused to open. The valley dropped 40 meters below it, straight down. Fog filled the bottom so thick you couldn't see the river. Just iron above, just white nothing below. Cole pulled the truck to the shoulder without thinking about it. He didn't remember deciding to stop. His hands just did it, the way hands do when the rest of you hasn't caught up yet. Atlas lifted his head from the back seat. The husky had been asleep since the Kentucky border. Now those 2 mismatched eyes, one the color of glacial ice, one the warm brown of creek water in October, were fixed on something through the windshield. The left eye pale and sharp, the right eye deep and still. Both of them watching the bridge with the focused calm of a dog who has learned that not everything worth paying attention to makes noise. "Yeah," Cole said. He didn't say anything else. Atlas didn't either. They sat there for 4 minutes. Cole counted without meaning to. Old habit. The kind of habit 18 years of active service builds into a person whether they want it or not. Count the seconds. Assess the structure. Know what you're walking into before you walk into it. He was looking at the bridge the way he used to look at things in other places. Checking load points, tracing stress lines in the iron. Reading the geometry of a structure that had been holding its own weight for 100 years, and seemed faintly annoyed that anyone would question whether it could keep doing so. "Condemned," the sign said, yellow and black, zip-tied to the chain-link fence someone had strung across the approach road. "Do not enter. Scheduled for demolition, pending authorization." Cole read it twice. Then he looked back at the bridge. The iron was red-orange where the rust had taken hold. Decades of weather had done that. But the bones underneath the main compression cords, the vertical posts, the diagonal tension members, those were still where they were supposed to be. He could see it from here. You couldn't fake structural geometry. Either the angles were right or they weren't. Either the load path made sense or the whole thing came down. These angles were right. He'd built enough things in enough bad places to know the difference between old and broken. This was old. This was not broken. He put the truck back in drive. The house his grandfather left him was 7 minutes from the bridge, which meant Cole had known for exactly 7 minutes that he was going to have a problem in Duskfield before he'd even found the kitchen. The house was small, gray clapboard siding gone pale with age. A porch that tilted 10 degrees to the left like a person leaning into a hard wind and just deciding to stay that way. 2 oaks in the front yard so old their roots had lifted the sidewalk into small mountains. A mailbox with no name on it, just a dent where a name used to be. His grandfather had left him the house and the land, and a letter that said 3 sentences. The place needs work. The view is worth it. Don't sell. That was all. Cole hadn't been to Duskfield since he was 9 years old. Hadn't spoken to his grandfather in 11 years. Hadn't known the man was sick or dying or gone until a lawyer in Richmond called him on a Tuesday in February while Cole was sitting in a VA waiting room trying to fill out a form that asked him to rate his pain on a scale from 1 to 10. He'd left the form on the chair. He'd driven to Dustfield instead. Because 1 through 10 had started to feel like a language he didn't speak anymore. Because the truck was already packed, had been packed for 3 weeks in a way that wasn't exactly a plan and wasn't exactly not a plan either. Because Atlas needed to run somewhere that wasn't a parking lot. Because somewhere along the road between the man he used to be and whatever he was now, Cole Hargrove had run out of better ideas. So, Duskfield. Atlas hopped out of the truck before Cole had the door fully open and immediately began a methodical inspection of the property, nose down, tail moving in that slow, deliberate arc that meant he was serious about this and didn't want to be interrupted. Cole stood on the crooked porch. He looked at the front door. The front door looked back. Neither of them did anything for a while. The hardware store was called Osteen's. It sat on the main block of Duskfield between a diner and a place that sold insurance and seemed to be the same person doing both. The sign above Osteen's was hand-painted red on white, the letters uneven in that particular way that meant someone had done it themselves and was proud of the imperfection. Cole went in because he needed a padlock for the back door of his grandfather's house. He stayed because of what was pinned to the bulletin board next to the register. A county notice, official seal, dated 6 weeks ago. Request for demolition bids. Iron Truss Railway Bridge, Harrow Gorge vicinity, Duskfield, West Virginia. Contractors to submit sealed bids for structure removal and material salvage by March 31st. Materials including estimated 180 tons of recoverable iron to become property of winning contractor. Contact Commissioner H. Pruitt, Caldwell County. Cole read it 3 times. 180 tons. He'd priced scrap iron once in a different context in a different life. He knew what that number meant. The man behind the counter was maybe 67, built like a fire hydrant with white hair cut military short and a gray beard that suggested a certain philosophical tolerance for ambiguity. He had the deliberate stillness of someone who had seen enough of the world that he'd stopped being surprised by most of it. "You're staring at that notice like it owes you money," the man said. Cole looked at him. "How long has that bridge been condemned?" "Officially 20 years. The man set down the bolt he'd been examining. "Unofficially, since the railroad stopped running in '88. Nobody's touched it since. Nobody wanted the liability." A pause. "You're not from here." "My grandfather was. Hargrove. Walter Hargrove's grandson." Something shifted in the man's face. Not dramatic, just a small recalibration, the kind people do when they realize they're in a different conversation than they thought. "Burl Osteen," the man said. He held out a hand. Cole shook it. "Cole." "I knew your grandfather." Burl said it the way people say things they've been waiting to say. Not sad, not sentimental, just true. "Good man, didn't talk much. Runs in the family." Burl almost smiled. "So I see." He looked at the notice on the board, then back at Cole. "You have an engineering question or a philosophical one. Can someone bid to preserve the bridge instead of demolish it?" Burl was quiet for 3 full seconds. "Nobody's asked that before," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," Burl said. "It's not." He crossed his arms. "The bid solicitation specifies material salvage. But the underlying question, whether a preservation bid would be legally accepted under the same process." He stopped. "You'd have to ask the county clerk or a lawyer." "I'll ask the county clerk." Burl studied him. The way you study something when you're trying to figure out if it's structural or decorative. "You know anything about iron bridges?" "I know about bridges in general." "That's not the same thing." "No," Cole agreed. "But it's a start." Atlas had been sitting outside the door, visible through the glass, watching the conversation with the patient authority of someone who has decided this is going well and doesn't want to jinx it. Burl looked at the dog, looked at Cole. That's a working dog. He works harder than I do. What do you do? Cole was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was complicated. The simple answer was, I used to build things that needed to survive, things that shouldn't be survivable. But that wasn't a sentence you said in a hardware store to a man you'd known for 4 minutes. I'm figuring that out, Cole said. Burl nodded, like that was an acceptable answer. Like it was, in fact, a more acceptable answer than most people gave. The county clerk's office is 2 blocks north, he said. Closes at 4. The gorge was something else when you stood on the bridge itself. Cole went that evening. After the county clerk's office. After the conversation with the clerk, a young woman named Dana, who had looked at his bid question with the expression of someone who had just been asked to divide by 0, excused herself for 11 minutes and returned with a supervisor who confirmed after consulting 3 different documents that, yes, technically, a preservation bid could be submitted under the same process. There was no mechanism to exclude it. Nobody had ever tried. $1, Cole had said, for a preservation contract rather than a salvage contract. The supervisor had looked at him for a long moment. I'll need to confirm with Commissioner Pruitt's office, she'd said. You do that, Cole had said. Now he was on the bridge. He'd gone around the chain-link fence, not under it, not through it, around it where it had come loose from its anchor on the right side, and left a gap just wide enough for a man and a large dog to pass through without technically touching anything marked condemned. Combat engineers had a term for this. It was called route reconnaissance. It was not called trespassing. Atlas walked slightly ahead of him, head low nose, reading the deck plates. The bridge's original wooden walkway was long gone. Just the iron deck grating remained open mesh so you could see through it to the gorge below. The fog had burned off. 40 meters down Cold Harbor River was a silver thread between black walls of rock. Cole walked to the center. He stopped. He looked down. 40 meters, roughly 13 stories. The kind of drop that made something ancient in your body say, pay attention. Not panic, just awareness. The kind that sharpened everything. He looked up instead. The main arch rose above him. Riveted iron, each rivet head, the size of his fist, placed by hand by men in 1923 who climbed these trusses without safety harnesses, and did not think of it as remarkable because danger was simply part of what things cost to build. He put his hand on the arch. The iron was cold, not winter cold, deeper than that. The cold of something that had been standing in weather for a century and had stopped noticing it. That was when he saw the names. They weren't hidden. That was the thing. They were right there on the main compression cord at eye level, chiseled into the iron with something sharp and deliberate. Not graffiti, not spray paint. These were carved names in the careful letters of men who wanted to be legible, who wanted to still be legible long after they weren't around to speak for themselves. T. Bruner, ironworker, 1923. R. Halsey and Son, 1923. G. Poole, Goodbridge, Earl Marsh, 1961. She still holds. That one stopped him. Earl Marsh, 1961. Not a builder, a visitor. Someone who had come back 38 years after construction and added his name because the bridge was still there, and that seemed worth noting. He kept reading, and then he found it. His hands had already gone still. His whole body had gone still the way it went still when something required processing that wasn't happening yet. He read the name twice, 3 times, touched it with 2 fingers like it might not be real. Walter Hargrove, 1923, his grandfather's name. His grandfather who had left him a house and 3 sentences and no explanation, and apparently had been one of the men who drove the rivets into this bridge when he was young enough that young didn't have a number yet. Cole stood there with his hand on his grandfather's name for a long time. Atlas sat down beside him and leaned against his leg. Neither of them said anything. Below them, the river moved. Above them, the iron held. The diner was called Patsy's, which told you everything about how long it had been there. The booths were red vinyl gone soft with decades of use. The coffee came in a mug you did not choose and was refilled without asking, which was either presumptuous or thoughtful, and in Duskfield seemed to be considered the same thing. Cole ate alone. Corner booth, back to the wall, old habit. Atlas waited outside, which he did without complaint because he was that kind of dog. The kind that had learned patience the way veterans learn patience. Not because the waiting was comfortable, but because impatience was a luxury for people who controlled their circumstances, and Atlas had long since recognized that controlling circumstances was not really what his job was. His job was to know where Cole was. That was mostly enough. The woman came in at 7:15. Cole didn't look up right away. He was aware of her the way you're aware of weather peripheral contextual noted and filed. Older. 70s maybe. A navy blue coat she'd owned for 20 years and saw no reason to replace. White hair pinned back with the efficiency of someone who solved problems without drama. She moved like a person whose knees weren't perfect, but whose dignity was non-negotiable. She stopped at his table. "You're the one who went onto the bridge," she said. It wasn't a question. Cole looked up. Her face was the kind of face that held decades without apology. Dark eyes, the steadiness of a woman who had outlasted several kinds of hard and stopped explaining herself to anyone. "Eugenia Marsh," she said. "People call me Jean." A pause. "Don't call me Eugenia." Cole Hargrove. Something moved in her expression. Hargrove. Walter Hargrove's grandson. She pulled out the other side of the booth and sat down. Just like that. No asking. No hovering. She sat down the way people sit when they've decided something, and the sitting is just the physical confirmation of a decision already made. "Walter helped build that bridge," she said. "I know, I found his name. Earl's name is up there too." She picked up the sugar dispenser and looked at it without putting sugar in anything. "Earl was my husband. He went back in '61 to check on it, brought his notebook, spent 3 days measuring and writing everything down." She set the sugar dispenser down. "He set a structure that old that well-built somebody should keep a record. In case." She looked at Cole. "In case of people like Pruitt, I suppose. Though he didn't know that then. Earl's notebook still exists. In my kitchen drawer." She said it the way you say, of course. "I don't throw things away." Cole was quiet for a moment, thinking about what that meant. A hand-drawn technical survey of the bridge from 1961, made by a man who loved it enough to come back. The kind of documentation that professional engineers charge thousands of dollars to produce. "I submitted a preservation bid today," Cole said. Gene watched him. $1, he said, "for the preservation contract, not the salvage contract." She was quiet for several seconds. "Pruitt won't like that," she said finally. "No. He has a contract with somebody. I don't know the details, but I know Harlan Pruitt, and I know when a man has already spent money he hasn't collected yet." She folded her hands on the table. "He'll find a way to stop you." "He can try." Gene looked at him. The look was the kind that takes a measure. Not of ambition or confidence she'd seen plenty of both go wrong. Of something quieter. Of whether the person across from her understood what they were actually getting into and had decided to get into it anyway. Whatever she saw, she seemed to file it somewhere useful. "I'll bring you Earl's notebook tomorrow," she said. "You don't know me." "I know who built you," she said. "Walter Hargrove was a man who finished what he started." She looked toward the window, toward the direction of the gorge, even though you couldn't see it from here. "I'd like to see what that bridge looks like when it's not covered in rust and county notices." She stood up. 6:30. "I bring the coffee." She walked out. Cole watched her go. Atlas through the diner window watched her go too. Then he looked at Cole with the expression of a dog who has made an assessment and sees no need to elaborate on it. He went back to the bridge after dark. He knew he shouldn't. The chain link fence was still there. The condemned sign was still there. Whatever the county clerk's office was doing with his bid was still in process, and nothing was resolved. And standing on a condemned structure at 9 in the evening was not the most defensible position if someone decided to make it an issue. He went anyway. Atlas went with him, went with. There was a moon, 3/4 full. It turned the iron silver at the tops of the trusses and left deep shadow in the lower geometry. The gorge below was invisible, just sound. The river 40 meters down, steady and indifferent. Cole stood at the center railing and listened to it. He thought about his grandfather. Walter Hargrove had been 22 years old when he drove rivets into this bridge. 22. Younger than some of the soldiers Cole had led. Young enough that his hands were probably steadier than they'd ever be again standing on iron girders above a 40-meter drop doing precise work in conditions that were not designed for error. And then 60 years of silence. No stories, no photographs on the wall, no "I helped build something that's still standing, want to see it." Just 3 sentences in a letter. A house that tilted slightly, a mailbox with no name, "Don't sell." Had he meant the house? Or had he somehow known, that Cole would find the bridge, that he'd stand where Walter once stood and put his hand on a name that proved something had existed before the army and after it, and apart from it, that there was a Walter Hargrove who built things for reasons that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with the simple, undefeatable desire to make something that lasted? He didn't know. He wouldn't know. But he was here. He was standing on the bridge. Atlas pressed against his left leg. Cole put his hand back on the iron arch. On Walter Hargrove, 1923. He left it there for a while. The metal was cold through his palm. Real. Certain. The kind of thing you could push against, and it pushed back not because it was hostile, but because it was solid. Because it had been put together correctly by men who knew what they were doing, and the correctness of it had outlasted everything else about them. He pulled out his folding knife, opened it, and he touched the blade to the iron just below his grandfather's name. Not cutting yet, just touching. The way you touch something before you commit to it. Not yet, he thought. He closed the knife, put it back in his pocket. There was work to do first. There was always work to do first. That was the thing about structures. You couldn't sign your name to something that wasn't finished. You couldn't claim it. You had to earn the right to be associated with it by demonstrating that you understood it well enough to keep it standing. He turned, started walking back toward the fence. Tomorrow, he said, to the bridge, to his grandfather's name, to the gorge and the river and the iron that had held through 100 winters without anyone asking it to. Atlas walked beside him. The bridge stood behind them in the moonlight silver and rust red, enormous and unasked for, holding its own weight over the dark nothing below. Like it had been doing since before either of them existed. Like it intended to keep doing. The county clerk called at 8 the next morning. Cole was on the porch with coffee watching fog lift off the oaks. Atlas was in the yard doing something investigative near the fence line. "Mr. Hargrove." The clerk's voice had the particular tension of someone relaying news they hadn't generated and didn't feel responsible for. "I spoke with Commissioner Pruitt's office regarding your bid submission." And, a pause. "The Commissioner's office has indicated that the bid solicitation terms specify material salvage operations. They're contesting whether a preservation bid falls within the scope of the solicitation." Cole set down his coffee. "The solicitation says bids for the bridge." His voice was level. Combat engineers learned level. When you were level, people had to decide for themselves whether to escalate. It doesn't say bids only for demolition. The commissioner's office interprets. I know what they interpret. He picked his coffee back up. "Tell them I'll be at the next public meeting of the county commission." Another pause, longer this time. "That's March 15th, she said. "I'll be there." He hung up, looked out at the oaks. Atlas trotted back from the fence line and sat at the porch steps looking up, both eyes attentive, waiting. Commissioner Pruitt has a contract with somebody to salvage that iron, Cole said, thinking out loud, which he'd started doing more of since Atlas and less of since most of his other conversational options had narrowed down in ways he didn't examine closely in the morning. 180 tons of recoverable iron. He already has the buyer, he already has the money figured. My bid complicates that. Atlas waited. He's going to try to disqualify it procedurally. Atlas waited, which means I need the bridge to be worth more to this county legally than it is financially. Cole picked up his coffee. Historic preservation designation, state level. If the State Historic Preservation Office reviews it and recommends it, the county commission has a much harder time authorizing demolition. Atlas's tail moved once, slowly. I know, Cole said. That takes time. The tail was still. Everything takes time. He looked toward the direction of the gorge, even though you couldn't see it from here. We have until March 15th. Jean Marsh arrived at 6:32, which was close enough to 6:30 that it counted. She had a thermos of coffee in one hand and a composition notebook in the other. Dark blue cover corners worn soft spine cracked from being opened flat 1,000 times. Earl Marsh's handwriting was small and precise. Engineer's handwriting. Dimensions in the margins. Load calculations. Sketches of connection details, riveted joints, the geometry of the main trusses, annotated with measurements in fractions of inches. 60 years old and still sharp enough to read without a magnifier. Cole sat at his kitchen table and went through it page by page. Jean drank her coffee and didn't say anything for a while. He loved it, she said eventually. Cole looked up. The bridge. She was looking at the notebook, not at him. He wasn't a man who loved many things out loud, but that bridge. A small pause. He went back 3 times in 40 years, just to check, just to make sure it was still there. She picked up her coffee. I thought he was peculiar about it. Now I think he knew something. He knew it was built right. Yes. She looked at Cole. Are you built right? It was such a direct question that it landed before he had time to deflect it. I don't know, he said, which was the most honest answer he'd given anyone in longer than he could accurately measure. Jean seemed to find that acceptable. Earl's measurements are still accurate, she said. I'd stake anything on it. She tapped the notebook. That's your technical baseline. 60-year-old survey by a man who knew what he was looking at, documenting that the structure was sound in 1961. She looked at him. Pruitt's hired somebody to say it's not sound now. You counter with somebody who says it was sound 60 years ago and ask them to account for the discrepancy. Cole looked at her. I've been married to an engineer for 40 years, she said, and listening for 40 more. She stood up. Burl Osteen's older brother has a civil engineering license. He's retired. He thinks Pruitt is... She paused. He has a very low opinion of Pruitt. He might look at this. Jean. She stopped. Why are you helping me? She was quiet for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, because she was choosing which version of it to give. Because I've watched that bridge rust for 35 years, she said, and every year I watch it, I think Earl would have had something to say about this. Earl would have done something. She picked up her thermos. And then I remember I'm the one still here. She looked at him steadily. So now I'm doing something. I just needed somebody to do it with. She walked out, the door closed. Not loud, not dramatic, just shut. Cole sat at the table with Earl Marsh's notebook open in front of him, the careful handwriting of a dead man who had loved a bridge enough to measure it twice and thought about what it meant to finish something that someone else had started. Atlas put his chin on the table, both eyes watching Cole's face. Patient. Present. Okay, Cole said. Atlas's tail moved once. Outside, beyond the tilted porch and the two ancient oaks beyond the diner and the hardware store, and the hand-painted signs, the iron giant stood over the gorge in the February light. Red and rust in 100 years of winter. Still standing, still waiting. March came in cold and stayed that way. Not the dramatic cold of January, not the kind that made people feel heroic for surviving it. March cold was the tired kind. The kind that had been going on too long and knew it. Gray sky every morning, frost on the truck windshield that took 10 minutes to scrape and came back by noon. The kind of cold that wasn't trying to kill you anymore, just wearing you down, just reminding you it was still there. Cole worked anyway. He was on the bridge by 7 every morning. Sometimes 6:30 if sleep had given up on him before the alarm did, which was most mornings. Atlas ran the gorge path below while Cole worked the deck. Above that was the routine they'd settled into without discussing it. The dog needed to run. The man needed to work. The bridge needed both of them in different ways and seemed to understand this. The first week was assessment. Pure combat engineer instinct. Before you touch anything, you learn it. Before you repair anything, you understand what failed and why. Cole walked every meter of the main span with Earl Marsh's notebook open in one hand and his own notebook in the other, comparing the 1961 measurements to what he could measure now, with a tape and a level and 60 years of additional weathering between them. The bones were good. That was the thing he kept coming back to. The bones were extraordinary, actually. The main compression cords, the great arching ribs of the truss, had lost maybe 3% of their cross-sectional area to surface corrosion. 3%. In a century of West Virginia winters, spring floods, ice loads, and nobody caring. The riveted connections were tight. The geometry hadn't moved. Whatever the men of 1923 had understood about iron and load, in the particular physics of a gorge that funneled wind in two directions, simultaneously they had understood it correctly. The surface was ugly. The surface was 100 years of rust and neglect and weather that had tried everything it had. Underneath was something that had refused to give. He wrote 4 words in his notebook, not as a technical observation, as something else, something he didn't have a professional term for. Surface is not structure. He looked at that for a while. Then he kept working. Burl Osteen's older brother was named Curtis. Curtis Osteen was 71 years old, retired civil engineer, and had the energy of a man who had been told to slow down at 65 and had been aggressively ignoring that instruction ever since. He drove a truck older than most of the people who fixed his coffee at Patsy's, wore reading glasses that sat permanently at the end of his nose, whether he was reading or not, and had, as Gene had accurately summarized, a very low opinion of Commissioner Harlan Pruitt. He tried to pave the creek trail in 2019, Curtis said by way of explaining the low opinion. He was on the bridge with Cole doing what Cole had been doing for a week, but faster because Curtis had been reading bridge geometry since before Cole was born. Said it was for accessibility. Half the creek trail is underwater 3 months a year. You can't pave a flood zone. He crouched at a lower cord connection, running his thumb over the riveted joint. I wrote a letter to the state. Pruitt called Burl and told him to tell me to mind my own business. He stood up. His knees complained. He ignored them. Made it my business on principle. What do you think, Cole asked, about the bridge? Not about Pruitt, because that was clearly a conversational direction with no foreseeable end. Curtis was quiet for a moment. He walked to the center railing, looked down at the gorge. The river was running fast with snowmelt. White water over the black rock, 40 meters below. I think, Curtis said slowly, that whoever submitted the report calling this structure in imminent danger has never actually stood on it. Pruitt commissioned the report. I know who commissioned it. I know the firm he used. Curtis's voice was dry. They do parking lot assessments and insurance inspections. They've never evaluated a riveted truss structure in their professional lives. He tapped the railing. This is a Pratt truss configuration with Phoenix column verticals. You don't see Phoenix columns outside of the 1880 to 1930 construction window. You know why. Labor intensive. Curtis pointed at him. Catastrophically labor-intensive and extraordinarily strong. The Phoenix column is a built-up section, rolled iron segments riveted together in a cruciform shape. It distributes load in 4 directions simultaneously. He looked up at the verticals rising above them. The men who built this didn't have computers. They didn't have finite element analysis. They had math and physics and the hard experience of watching bridges fail and the absolute determination to not be responsible for one that did. A pause. They overbuilt this on purpose because that was how you built something meant to last. Cole stood next to him and looked up. Will you write a counter-assessment? Cole asked. Curtis looked at him sideways. Already started it in my head on the drive over. He pushed his glasses up. It won't be fast. Done right, it'll take 3 weeks, maybe 4. March 15th is the commission meeting. Then I'll have something for you by the 14th. He started walking back toward the approach. Gene said you submitted a preservation bid. $1. Curtis stopped, turned around. $1. For preservation, not salvage. Curtis looked at him for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile. Something more internal. The expression of a man recalculating. Walter Hargrove's grandson, he said. Not a question. Yes, sir. Your grandfather drove rivets on this bridge. Did you know that? Found out recently. Curtis nodded, like that explained something he'd been trying to place. He used to come into the hardware store when I was a boy. Always knew what he needed before he asked. Never wasted your time. He turned back toward the approach. I'll have your counter-assessment by the 14th. He walked off the bridge. Atlas, waiting at the fence line, watched him pass and then looked at Cole with the quiet satisfaction of a dog whose rat on a situation has been confirmed. The commission meeting notice went up on what Burrell pointed out was a particularly pointed date, which was not, he said dryly, a coincidence in a town where Harlan Pruitt controlled what went on the bulletin board outside the county office. The notice had been changed, not dramatically, subtly, the kind of change that bureaucratic systems made when they wanted to alter an outcome without appearing to. The bid evaluation had been moved to an internal review process. The March 15th public meeting would now address the bridge as a line item under County Infrastructure Disposal Protocol, which was not a public hearing but an administrative session, which meant no public comment, which meant Cole's counter-assessment from Curtis couldn't be formally entered into the record, which meant Pruitt had been doing his own math. Cole found out on a Tuesday. He stood in front of the county office notice board for 2 full minutes, reading, not because the words were hard, because he was making sure he understood exactly what he was looking at before he decided what to do about it. He understood. He walked to Burrell's store. He moved it to administrative session, Cole said. Burrell was behind the counter. He set down what he was holding. When notice just went up, Burrell was quiet, the quiet of a man who was angry in a practice-controlled way. He can do that, he said finally. Administrative sessions don't require public input. He controls 5 of the 9 commission votes. I need this to be a public matter. You need state involvement. Burrell said it immediately, like he'd been waiting for the conversation to arrive here. If the State Historic Preservation Office opens a formal review, the county can't proceed with demolition while the review is pending. State law. He looked at Cole. You'd need to submit a nomination for the State Historic Register. Documentation, photographs, historical significance statement. The SHPO office in Charleston does intake reviews within about 30 days. Curtis's assessment covers the technical side. You need the historical side too, why this bridge matters to this community, to the state's industrial heritage. Burrell picked up what he'd been holding, a bolt, turned it in his hand. Jean could write that. She knows that history better than anyone alive. He looked up. The question is whether 30 days is fast enough. Pruitt's administrative session is in 2 weeks. Then the SHPO submission needs to go in tomorrow. Cole pulled out his notebook. What do I need? The next 10 days were something else. Cole worked the bridge from first light until he lost the light. Mornings were structural. He'd identified the sections that needed immediate stabilization. 3 corroded floor beam connections on the north span, a cracked lateral brace in the upper cord surface rust that needed treatment before spring rain worked it deeper. He couldn't fix everything. He didn't try. He triaged the way he'd been trained to triage. What fails first? What holds longest? What you touch first so that everything else has a chance. Afternoons, he worked the paperwork, which was its own kind of structure. Gene wrote the historical significance statement at Cole's kitchen table in longhand, which Cole then typed, and which was better than anything he could have written, because Gene wrote the way people speak when they've lived with something long enough that the emotion and the fact have become the same thing. Cold Harbor Iron Bridge, she wrote, was not constructed by a company. It was constructed by men from this valley who understood that the gorge between them was a problem and decided to solve it. The workers who drove these rivets were neighbors. They ate together. Their names are on the iron. Their grandchildren are still here. A structure is not historic because it is old. It is historic because it is specific, because it belongs to a particular place and a particular people. And removing it removes something that cannot be recreated, rebuilt, or replaced. Cole read that twice. He typed it without changing a word. The SHPO package went out on a Wednesday. Certified mail. Electronic submission backup. Cole kept copies of everything. 3 separate physical copies. Combat engineer habit. You documented because in the field, if something wasn't documented, it didn't exist. If it didn't exist, you couldn't prove it. If you couldn't prove it, it didn't count. He was building a case the same way he built structures, from the foundation up. Pruitt came to the bridge on a Thursday. Cole saw the county truck from 30 meters out and kept working. He was treating corroded sections of the upper cord with a rust converter. Both hands busy, eye level with iron that had been neglected for 30 years and was responding to the attention with the guarded, slow improvement of something that had learned not to trust too quickly. He heard boots on the deck plates. Didn't turn around. Mr. Hargrove. Cole applied converter to a rivet head. Commissioner. Harlan Pruitt was 61 and built like a man who had once been fit and had decided in his 50s that appearances were for people who needed something from others, which Pruitt had arranged his life to not do. He wore a county jacket in the expression of someone who was used to conversations going the way he intended them to go. You've been busy, Pruitt said. Yes, sir. I noticed you submitted a package to the State Historic Preservation Office. Cole moved to the next rivet. That's public record. It is. Pruitt walked closer, stopped, looked at the work Cole had done. His expression didn't change, which was its own kind of tell. You understand that a SHPO review doesn't stop the administrative process. It creates a parallel process, which the county is not required to defer to, which the county may choose to defer to. Cole turned around, looked at Pruitt directly. Or not. And then whoever makes that choice owns the decision publicly. Pruitt looked back at him, the look of a man recalculating what kind of problem this was. Not whether it was a problem. It was clearly a problem. Just what kind? You're spending a lot of effort on something that isn't going to be here in 6 months, Pruitt said. Might be here 100 years, Cole said, depending on how things go. A pause. Who's paying for your materials? I am. You. Yes. Another pause. Longer. What exactly is your interest here, Mr. Hargrove? You moved to Duskfield in February. You've been here 10 weeks. You don't have a job. You don't have, as far as I can tell, any particular connection to this community. Cole looked at him for a moment. Then he turned back to the iron. My great-grandfather drove the rivets on this bridge, he said. His name is on the arch, so is Earl Marsh's. So are about 40 other men whose families are still in this valley. He applied converter to another section. That's my interest. Silence, then Pruitt's boots on the deck plates going the other direction. Then nothing. Cole kept working. Atlas on the gorge path below barked once. Sharp, clear. The way he barked when something needed noting and he'd decided Cole wasn't paying sufficient attention. Cole looked over the railing. The dog was sitting at the base of the approach watching Pruitt's truck drive away, watching it until it rounded the bend and disappeared. Then he looked up at Cole, both eyes steady. Still here, that look said. Yeah, Cole said. Still here. There was another deadline that wasn't about the calendar. Money was a deadline, too. Cole had savings from 18 years of active service and not spending much of it, because when you're deployed, there's not a lot of opportunity for retail therapy, and he'd never been a man with expensive habits. But savings were not infinite. Materials weren't free. The rust converter alone had cost more than he'd estimated. The floor beam connections needed steel plate and proper fasteners. The lateral brace in the upper cord needed a fabricated replacement that was going to cost more than he currently had. He didn't tell anyone this, because telling people you were running low on the thing you needed to keep going felt like a different kind of failing, and Cole Hargrove had a complicated relationship with that particular feeling. Jean noticed anyway. She always noticed. She showed up one morning with coffee and her notebook the way she did most mornings, and watched him work for a few minutes in the comfortable silence they'd built between them, and then said, "You're rationing the rust converter." He didn't answer. "Cole, I'm being careful. You're running out." She said it the same way she said everything. Like the softening of facts was a courtesy she'd decided not to extend. "How much do you need to finish the stabilization work?" "Jean, don't do that." Her voice was firm, not unkind. "Don't be proud about money when there's a bridge at stake. Earl would have told you that." She looked at the work he'd done on the upper cord. Earl was terrible at asking for help, too. "I had 40 years to work on that. I'm working faster with you because I don't have 40 years. Cole looked at her. She was 72 years old and she was standing on a condemned bridge in April, wearing her good coat and looking at him like he was going to make sense eventually, and she was prepared to wait. $1,400 would finish the stabilization phase, he said. "All right. Jean, I'm not taking..." "It's not charity." She reached into her coat pocket and produced a folded check, set it on the railing between them. "It's an investment. I want this bridge to still be here when my grandchildren bring their children to see it. That's a direct financial interest, and I'm choosing to act on it." She picked up her coffee. "Also, Earl would have wanted me to, so I'm counting it as his money, which means you can't argue with me about it because Earl's been gone 11 years, and he always had better sense about these things than either of us." Cole looked at the check. He picked it up. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome." She turned back to the gorge view. What's next after stabilization? Surface treatment on the main arch, then the floor beam replacements. Curtis says the county can't touch the bridge once the SHPO review opens formally. That's correct. Has the review opened? We're waiting on the acknowledgement letter. Jean was quiet for a moment. How long does that take? About 30 days from submission, give or take. We submitted a few weeks ago. Yes. She did the math. So did Cole. Not many days left either way. They had a narrow window before the SHPO review either opened and gave them cover or didn't, and left them with an administrative session they couldn't formally address and a commissioner who had 5 votes and a contract already signed. Work faster, Jean said. Cole almost smiled. Almost. Something else happened during those weeks that Cole only understood later. Meredith Pruitt had started watching. Not the bridge exactly. She'd driven past it a few times the way you drove past things in a small town because there were only so many roads. But she'd started noticing what her husband said at dinner, the way he said it. Harlan Pruitt was not a man who revealed himself easily. 30 years of marriage had taught her that, but she learned to read the silences between his sentences the way a person learned to read weather. When he mentioned Cole Hargrove's name, which was more often than seemed casual, something tightened in his voice. Not anger, calculation. She didn't know yet what she was looking at, but she was starting to look. The storm came without much warning. May in West Virginia could do that. Could be soft for 3 weeks and then remember it was still spring and decide to make a point about it. The sky went green-yellow late on a Thursday afternoon, the color that meant the atmosphere was having a disagreement with itself about what kind of weather was appropriate. Cole came down off the bridge at 5. He'd been high on the upper cord replacing the lateral brace. 40 meters up, wind picking up from the southwest clouds, building the way clouds build when they have somewhere to be and intend to get there. He'd finished the brace connection, got the last bolt torqued, and made the decision to come down before the decision made itself. He was at his grandfather's house by 5:30. By 6, the rain had started. By 8, it was something different. Not just rain, volume. The kind of rainfall that overwhelmed the ground's ability to absorb it before it could even try. The gorge, Cole had learned this from Burl, who had learned it from 40 years of watching, was a natural funnel. Water from 3 separate ridgelines drained into Cold Harbor River through the gorge. In a normal heavy rain, the river rose 2 feet. In a real event, it could rise 12 in 4 hours. He was on the porch with Atlas at 9:15 watching water run down the driveway in sheets when his phone rang. Burl. Gene crossed the bridge this afternoon, Burl said, without preamble. Went to visit Miriam Talley on the south side. Roads flooded out below the gorge. She can't get back. Cole stood up. The bridge is still there, he asked. It's there. Cole, the river's already up 6 feet. It hits the underside of the deck at 10. Jean's 72, and she's not going to try to cross that in the dark in a storm. I'm going. The bridge is under a stop work order. I know. Deputy Briggs has been sitting on the south approach all week, watching for... I know that too. Cole was already moving. Jacket, rope, the headlamp from his go bag that he'd packed out of habit and never unpacked, because some habits stayed useful. Burl, who knows that side of the gorge? Miriam Talley's place is the 3rd driveway south of the bridge. Green mailbox. Okay. Cole. Yeah. Come back, Burl said, quietly, not dramatically, just a fact he wanted on the record. That's the plan, Cole said. Atlas was already at the door. The gorge road was a river, not metaphorically. The gravel surface had disappeared under 8 inches of fast-moving water that reflected Cole's headlamp back at him in fractured light. He drove as far as he could, which was not far because the truck was not a boat, and parked on high ground and went the rest on foot. Atlas stayed with him. No hesitation. No checking whether this was a good idea. The dog had made his position on good ideas clear a long time ago. If Cole was doing it, Atlas was doing it, and the risk assessment was Cole's problem, not his. The approach to the bridge was underwater at the base, but passable. Cole waded through knee-deep current that was cold enough to take his breath and fast enough to require planning every step before trusting it. The chain-link fence was still there, still condemning things, still suggesting that nobody enter. Cole went around it. The bridge deck was above the flood level barely. 2 feet of clearance between the underside of the deck and the surface of the river, which was black and fast and carrying debris. Branches, something that might have been a fence post. The roar of it was enormous in the gorge. The iron transmitted its vibration through the deck plates, through his boots, up through his legs. The bridge was talking, not panicking, steady. Just, I am aware of this. I am accounting for this. I have done this before. Cole moved, not running. Running on wet iron grating 40 meters above a flooded gorge was how you became the thing the river was carrying. He moved the way he'd been trained to move through uncertain structures. Weight tested before it was committed. Hands on the truss members for reference more than support. Eyes on where he was going, not on what was below. Atlas crossed faster than he did. Of course he did. The south side of the gorge was higher ground. The road was intact. Cole found Miriam Talley's house green mailbox exactly as described, and found Jean Marsh on the porch wearing Miriam Talley's coat over her own coat, holding a cup of something hot, watching the storm, with the expression of someone who has decided to be calm about a situation because the alternative is not useful. She saw Cole. She looked at him for a moment. "You came through the bridge," she said. "Yes." "In this." "It's still standing." She set down the cup. "I told Miriam not to call anyone." "She didn't. Burl did." Jean closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. "I am going to have words with Burl Osteen. He was worried. He was meddling. Both things can be true." She stood up, straightened her borrowed coat, looked at the rain like it had inconvenienced her personally, and she wanted it to know she'd noted this. Then she looked at Cole. "The river, 2 feet of clearance at the deck, and you want to cross that in the dark. I want to get you home." She was quiet. Atlas sat at the bottom of the porch steps looking up at her. Ice eye, amber eye, both patient, both waiting. "That dog," Jean said, "is looking at me like I don't have a choice." "You have a choice," Cole said. "You can stay at Miriam's tonight." "My medication is at my house." She said it simply, not dramatically, just a fact that changed the calculation. Cole nodded. "Stay close to the truss," he said. "Don't look down. Put your hand on the cord if you need it. The iron is wet, but it won't move." He looked at her. "You're going to be fine." "I know I'm going to be fine," Jean said with the firmness of a woman who had survived 72 years by declining to be otherwise. "I'm just noting that this is an unusual Thursday evening." "Yes, ma'am." She walked down the porch steps. Atlas fell in on her left side. Cole fell in on her right. And they crossed. It wasn't dramatic. That was the thing about real moments. They didn't announce themselves the way stories suggested they would. There was no swelling music, no pause for significance. There was wet iron grating and the roar of the river below, and Jean Marsh's hand on the truss cord not gripping, just resting the touch of someone who trusted the thing she was touching, and Atlas moving at her knee like he'd been placed there by someone who understood exactly what was needed. They were halfway across when Jean stopped. Cole stopped. She was looking up, at the arch, at Earl Marsh, 1961. She still holds, right there above her, 5 feet up on the main cord legible, even in the rain and the dark, because Earl had cut those letters deep and cut them true. She stood there for 4 seconds. Cole counted without meaning to. Old habit. Then she exhaled. Just a breath, not a sob, not a breakdown. Just the sound of a woman releasing something she'd been carrying long enough that she'd forgotten it had weight. "She still holds," Jean said. "To the bridge, to Earl, to something Cole wasn't part of and didn't need to be part of." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "She does." They kept walking. The north bank came up under their feet. Solid ground. Cole steadied Jean's arm as she stepped off the deck onto the approach. Atlas shook river water off his coat in a spray that caught the headlamp light and scattered it sideways. "Your dog," Jean said, "is ridiculous. He knows." She looked at Cole, then at the bridge behind them, the iron standing in the flood, roaring and wet and enormous, and exactly where it was supposed to be. "I'd like to see Pruitt's face," she said, "when the SHPO letter arrives." Cole looked at her. "We might be closer than you think," she said quietly. And in the morning, the quiet, wrecked, waterlogged morning, after a storm that had tried everything it had, Cole sat on his grandfather's porch and found an email on his phone. State Historic Preservation Office. Subject: Cold Harbor Iron Bridge Review Status Update. Dear Mr. Hargrove, we are pleased to confirm that your nomination has been accepted for formal review under the West Virginia State Historic Register process. Per State Historic Preservation Law, no demolition, removal, or material alteration of the nominated structure may proceed during the pendency of this review without explicit SHPO authorization. Estimated review completion 90 days. Cole read it twice. Then he looked at Atlas, who was watching him from the porch steps. 90 days, Cole said. Atlas's tail moved, slow, deliberate. Outside, the gorge was still running high, but the rain had stopped. And somewhere under all that water, Cold Harbor River was already falling back toward where it belonged. And above it, above the flood and the debris and the 35 years of nobody caring, the Iron Giant stood in the morning light, red and rust and exactly as it had always been, still holding. The SHPO letter changed things. Not immediately. Not the way things changed in movies where one piece of paper turned the lights on and everybody clapped and went home. Real change was slower than that, grittier. It moved the way rivers moved after a flood. The water receded, the debris settled, and what remained was a landscape that looked almost the same as before but wasn't. Couldn't be. Because the ground had shifted underneath. What the letter did was buy time. 90 days. Which sounds like a lot until you start spending it. Pruitt's response came 8 days later. Not a phone call, not a visit. A legal notice delivered by Deputy Weston Briggs, who drove out to the bridge on a Tuesday morning and stood at the chain-link fence with an envelope and the expression of a man who had been given a task he hadn't fully signed up for. Cole came down from the upper cord, wiped his hands on his work pants, took the envelope. Briggs didn't leave right away. That was notable. Briggs had been Pruitt's instrument for most of the spring, showing up to document the work note, the stop work order violations, be the visible presence that reminded Cole the county was watching. He'd done it without apparent opinion. Professional, correct. The kind of correctness that didn't cost anything because it required no actual decision. Today he lingered. The commissioner filed a counter motion, Briggs said, not reading from anything, just saying it. Arguing that the SHPO review process was improperly initiated because the nomination lacked sufficient documentation of community significance. Cole looked at the envelope. He's saying Jean's letter doesn't count, Cole asked. Briggs was quiet for a moment. He's saying one person's testimony isn't sufficient to establish community significance. One person. That's what the filing says. Cole opened the envelope, read the first page, put it back. He looked at Briggs. Briggs looked back. The look of a man standing at a line he hadn't crossed yet, aware of the line, aware of what crossing it would mean. How many signatures would establish community significance? Cole asked. Briggs said nothing, which was itself a kind of answer. Cole nodded. Thanks for driving out. Briggs walked back to his cruiser, stopped at the door, didn't turn around. The petition form, he said to the door to the air to nobody in particular, is available at the county clerk's office. Public record. Anybody can pick one up. A pause. Anybody. He got in the car, drove away. Atlas watched the cruiser until it was gone, then looked at Cole. I heard it, Cole said. Jean had the petition forms by noon. Cole didn't know how she got them so fast. He didn't ask. Jean Marsh operated on a frequency that didn't require explanation, and asking her to explain things was like asking the river to justify its direction. It went where it went. Things got done. The mechanism was largely irrelevant. She brought them to Patsy's Diner at 12:30 and sat in the corner booth and started making calls. Cole watched her from the counter. She had a list, handwritten, 3 pages, names and phone numbers in the small, precise script of a woman who had been keeping records of people her whole life because people mattered, and mattering required documentation. He turned back to his coffee. Community significance. He'd been turning that phrase over since Briggs left. Not with anger, with the focus of someone who recognized the nature of the obstacle and was already looking for the road around it. Pruitt's argument was technically correct. One letter, one voice was a thin foundation. But it wasn't the foundation Cole had built. He had Curtis's engineering assessment. He had Earl's 1961 notebook. He had the SHPO submission with 47 pages of documentation that Gene had helped compile over 3 weeks of evenings at his kitchen table. What he didn't have, not formally, not on paper, was people, which was different from signatures. Signatures were easy. People showed up, people signed, people went home. What Pruitt's challenge required was something harder, something that demonstrated that the bridge wasn't just old, that it was theirs, that it belonged to Duskfield the way things belonged to places when they'd been there long enough to become part of how the place understood itself. He needed stories, not from him. He'd been here 4 months. His story was too new, too clean. He needed stories from people who had been here long enough that the bridge was part of their memory, who had crossed it as children, who had a name carved somewhere in that iron, who had stood on it at a particular moment in their life and felt whatever people felt when a structure reminded them that some things lasted. He went to find Burl. Burl Osteen had lived in Dustfield for 67 of his 67 years. This was notable because Dustfield was not a place that made staying easy. It was not a place with abundant opportunity or significant amenity or the kind of cultural infrastructure that got written up in magazines. It was a place that required choosing, consciously, repeatedly. Every time someone offered you a reason to leave, you had to decide again whether to stay. Burl had decided, approximately 10,000 times by his own estimate. Cole sat across from him in the back of Osteen's hardware, among the organized chaos of small parts drawers and replacement handle stock, and the smell of oil and metal that Cole had decided was the smell of people who fix things instead of replacing them. "Tell me about the bridge," Cole said. "Not the engineering, not the history. Tell me what it was." Burl was quiet for a moment. "When I was 8 years old," he said, "my father drove us across that bridge in a 1954 Ford pickup. It was February, ice on the road. The truck slid on the approach and came about 6 inches from going through the railing. He turned a bolt in his fingers. My mother grabbed my arm so hard she left a bruise. I remember thinking the bridge held. The truck could go anywhere, but the bridge held." A pause. "I've thought about that whenever something was uncertain, whenever I didn't know if a thing would hold." He looked at Cole. "That bridge is how I learned that some things are reliable when everything else isn't." Cole wrote that down. "Who else?" he asked. It took 9 days. Cole drove every road in Caldwell County, knocked on doors, sat in kitchens, sat on porches, drove out to the farms and the subdivisions and the 3 separate trailer parks on the east side of the county where the people lived who didn't get mentioned in official correspondence but had been here as long as anyone. He told each of them the same thing. "Commissioner Pruitt is calling this bridge a liability. He says nobody cares about it except one person. I want to know if that's true. Nobody said it was true, not one person." An 80-year-old man named Theodore Greer had proposed to his wife on that bridge in 1967. She had said yes. She had been gone 12 years. He still had the photograph. He found it in a drawer while Cole sat at his kitchen table and held it out with shaking hands, black and white, a young woman laughing in the iron arch above her. A woman named Patricia Doyle had brought her son to the bridge every birthday until he was old enough to drive himself there. She wasn't sure why she'd started the tradition. It had seemed right. It had kept being right. Her son was 34 now and lived in Pittsburgh. She'd called him the week before, told him what was happening. He'd driven back down on a Saturday and stood on the bridge for an hour. Just stood there. Said he needed to. A retired school teacher named Horace Webb had taken his 7th grade science class to the bridge every spring for 22 years. Not because it was in the curriculum, because he believed children should understand that physics was not abstract, that load and tension and the geometry of forces were not ideas. They were real. They were in things you could touch. And the best thing you could touch to understand all of that was a bridge built by hand 100 years ago by men who didn't have computers and somehow got it exactly right. 22 years, probably 400 children who had stood on that iron deck and learned something true. Cole wrote it all down. Every name, every story, every specific detail, because specificity was not sentimentality, it was evidence. It was the difference between people care about this, and here is exactly how, and exactly who, and exactly since when. He came home each evening with his notebook full. Atlas was always at the door, not waiting, attending. There was a difference. Atlas didn't pace or whine. He simply positioned himself where he could see the driveway and occupied that position with the focused calm of someone who had decided this was his job and had no complaints about the job. Cole would sit on the porch and read through his notes. Atlas would sit beside him. The gorge was invisible in the dark but audible. The river, back to its normal level, now moved below the bridge with the steady indifference of something that had its own schedule and had never needed anyone's permission to keep it. This is what I came back for, Cole thought. On the seventh night, looking at his notebook full of names. Not the bridge exactly, not the legal case, not Pruitt. This, the thing under all of it, that there were people here who had been quietly faithful to something for decades, who had never stopped going back, who had held on to photographs and stories and specific memories of specific moments on that iron deck, not because anyone told them to, because the bridge had been there, because it had held, because some things earned loyalty by being reliable when everything else wasn't. He put his hand on Atlas's back. The dog leaned into it. "We're going to be okay," Cole said. Atlas didn't argue. The supplemental documentation package went to the SHPO on a Friday. 43 personal statements, 68 signatures on the formal petition. Curtis Osteen's engineering counter-assessment, 27 pages with photographs and load calculations, and a point-by-point dismantling of Pruitt's commission report that Curtis had written with the contained fury of a man who had been a professional for 45 years and took the misuse of engineering authority personally. Gene's revised significant statement expanded from 2 pages to 7. Theodore Greer's photograph, included with permission, because sometimes a black and white image of a young woman laughing under an iron arch said more than any number of technical documents. Cole drove it to Charleston himself, because some things you delivered in person. The SHPO intake coordinator was a woman in her 50s who had clearly seen every variety of historic preservation submission the state of West Virginia had produced in the last 20 years. She took the package with professional neutrality, weighted apparently in whatever internal scale intake coordinators used. Then she looked at the photograph. "Just for a second. I'll note the supplemental submission today," she said. "The review team will have it by Monday." Cole nodded, picked up his empty bag. "Mr. Hargrove," she said. He stopped. "The original nomination was solid," she said, carefully, professionally, with the precision of someone who was not saying more than she should. "What you've added here," she looked at the package, "makes it something else." He drove home. Meredith Pruitt found the envelope on a Wednesday. Cole didn't know this when it happened. He found out later. But the sequence of it mattered, so here is how it went. Meredith was doing laundry. This was not remarkable. Meredith Pruitt did laundry on Wednesdays because she had done laundry on Wednesdays for 31 years, and the structure of her week was not something she reconsidered. She was going through the pockets of Harlan's field coat, also not remarkable because Harlan was the kind of man who left things in pockets, and Meredith was the kind of woman who had learned to check, and she found a folded envelope. Inside was a contract. Not a county contract, a private contract, between Commissioner H. Pruitt and a company called Allegheny Metal Reclamation, Inc., dated 8 months ago, before the bid solicitation had even been published, before anyone in Duskfield had been notified. The contract specified 180 tons of recovered iron, guaranteed delivery contingent on demolition completing by October 31st of the current year. Payment of $94,000 to a private account, not a county account, not the county infrastructure fund, not any account that appeared in the public record, a private account. Meredith sat on the laundry room floor. She didn't know how long she sat there, long enough that the washer finished its cycle and moved into spin, long enough that the afternoon light shifted, long enough to understand completely and without remaining uncertainty what she was looking at. Harlan hadn't tried to stop Cole because the bridge was dangerous. He tried to stop Cole because Cole was standing between Harlan and $94,000 that nobody was supposed to know about. And the bridge. The bridge that Theodore Greer had proposed to his wife on, that Horace Webb had taken 400 children to, that Earl Marsh had come back to measure because he loved it, that had Walter Hargrove's name in the iron placed there by a man who drove rivets in 1923 and wanted to still be legible when he was gone. Harlan had been going to sell it for scrap and pocket the money and tell everyone it was for the public good. Meredith thought about the dinners where Harlan had come home and mentioned the bridge, the tight, calculating sound of his voice, the way he talked about Cole Hargrove like a problem to be managed. She'd been watching for weeks without knowing what she was watching. Now she knew. She folded the contract back into the envelope. She sat with it for 4 days. She did not confront Harlan. She thought about this carefully. She was not doing this out of anger. Or not only out of anger, she was doing this because she had lived in Duskfield for 31 years, and her children had grown up here, and her grandchildren were going to grow up here. And the place her grandchildren grew up deserved to be governed by people who hadn't secretly sold it to a scrap metal company. On the 5th day, she called Burl Austin. She told him what she had. Burl said, "Can you make a copy?" Meredith said, "I already made 3. Cole found out from Burl, who called on a Saturday morning while Cole was on the bridge applying the last section of rust converter to the east span, which he'd been working toward for 6 weeks and was maybe 20 minutes from finishing. He came down. He sat at the base of the approach on a flat rock that had become over the months something like his thinking rock. Atlas sat next to him. He read the text Burl had sent. The photograph of the contract, the account number, the date, 8 months ago, 2 months before the bid solicitation went public. He sat with it, $94,000. Not a vast fortune, not a conspiracy of enormous scale, just a man who saw an asset nobody was watching and decided to convert it to personal use while calling it public service. The oldest kind of corruption. Small enough to feel ordinary, large enough to cost a community something it couldn't replace. Cole thought about Pruitt standing on the bridge, saying this isn't going to be here in 6 months. Not as a prediction, as a plan, already worked out, already contracted, already as good as done in his mind. And Cole's $1 bid had walked into the middle of it, not knowing, just because a bridge deserved to not be scrap metal. He looked at Atlas. "Meredith Pruitt," he said. "She found it." Atlas's tail moved once. "She went to Burl," Cole said. "Not to a lawyer, not to the paper, to Burl." Which was the right call, because Burl knew everyone, and everyone trusted Burl. And what was about to happen needed to happen in a specific sequence, in a specific place, in a way that was undeniable and public and couldn't be quietly managed. The county commission meeting was in 11 days. The night before the commission meeting, Jean brought dinner. She did this occasionally, without announcement, without asking whether it was needed. She simply arrived at 5:30 with a covered dish and the air of someone who had decided that the people around her were going to eat a proper meal, and that was not a negotiable position. They ate at Cole's kitchen table, the one that tilted slightly because one leg was a 1/4 inch shorter than the others, which Cole had noticed in February and had not fixed because there were things that needed fixing and things that had become familiar, and the table had moved into the second category without his fully noticing. Jean didn't mention the contract, the commission meeting, Pruitt, any of it. She talked about Earl, not with grief, with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had lived with a person long enough that the person had become part of how she thought. She talked about the first time Earl had taken her to see the bridge, 1962, a year after he'd gone back with his notebook. She'd been skeptical. It was a bridge. What was there to see? She'd stood on it and looked down at the gorge and understood something she hadn't understood before. He said, she paused, picked up her coffee. He said the difference between something that's built right and something that's just built is invisible until it's not. You can't see it in the good years, only when something tries to knock it down. Cole looked at her. He was talking about the bridge, Jean said, but he was also talking about people. She set down her cup. I've thought about that for 60 years, wondered which kind I was. She looked at Cole with those dark, steady eyes. I think I know now. Cole didn't say anything, which was the right response. Some things didn't need a response, they needed to be received. Atlas put his chin on Jean's knee. She looked down at him, then at Cole. Your grandfather would have liked this dog. Burl's brother said the same thing. Well, she picked up her fork again. We're both right. The county commission meeting was held at 7 in the evening in the Caldwell County Administrative Building, which was a 1970s brick structure that had the institutional quality of a place designed to process things rather than to welcome them. The meeting room held 40 seats. There were 93 people in it. Cole knew the fire marshal was going to have thoughts about this, but the fire marshal was also in the room, and he was sitting next to Theodore Greer, and they appeared to be having a pleasant conversation. So Cole decided this was not his immediate problem. Pruitt arrived at 6:55. He walked in and saw the room and stopped. Not dramatically, just a half-second pause. The pause of a man doing rapid recalculation. 93 people in a room designed for 40 was not the administrative proceeding he had constructed in his mind over the past 3 months. This looked different from what he had planned. He sat down. His jaw was set. His eyes swept the room once, cataloging, assessing. They found Cole in the third row. They found Burl beside him, Jean on Cole's other side, Curtis Osteen behind them, Theodore Greer, Horace Webb, Patricia Doyle, Deputy Briggs not in uniform sitting in the back row, which was its own quiet statement, and Meredith Pruitt sitting in the second row, not looking at her husband. The meeting was called to order at 7:03. The commission chair, a woman named Barbara Ellison, who had been running these meetings for 11 years and had the battle-tested composure of someone who had seen most varieties of county political drama, moved through preliminary items with efficient professionalism. She reached the bridge. Item 7, she said, Cold Harbor Iron Bridge disposition. Commissioner Pruitt, you submitted a motion for administrative authorization of the demolition contract pending SHPO review completion. That's correct, Pruitt said. The chair notes receipt of a supplemental petition and supporting documentation submitted to this body and to the SHPO on behalf of the preservation interest. She looked up. Mr. Hargrove, you're the preservation bid holder. Cole stood. Yes, ma'am. You have something to submit to the commission. 2 things, Cole said. He placed Earl Marsh's notebook on the table in front of the commission. The original, not a copy. Because sometimes the realness of a thing, the worn cover, the soft corners, the handwriting of a man who had driven to a bridge he loved because he wanted to make sure it was still standing, said something that a copy couldn't. Engineering documentation, he said. 1961 survey of the bridge structure by Earl Marsh, qualified ironworker, showing the structure sound at that date. Supplemented by Curtis Osteen's current assessment, showing the structure remains sound today, contrary to the report submitted by Commissioner Pruitt's commission firm. He placed Curtis's assessment beside the notebook. And this, he said. He placed the copy of the contract on the table. The room went quiet. The quiet that rooms go when something has entered them that changes the nature of what's happening. Private contract, Cole said, between Commissioner Pruitt and Allegheny Metal Reclamation Incorporated, dated 8 months prior to the public bid solicitation, specifying payment of $94,000 to a private account for 180 tons of recovered iron contingent on bridge demolition. He looked at the commission, not at Pruitt. This contract predates the public process by 8 months. The account specified is not a county account. Chair Ellison was looking at the document. She was very still. Where did this come from? She asked. Cole didn't answer that, because it wasn't his to answer. He looked at the second row. Meredith Pruitt stood up. She did it without drama, without announcement. The way a person stood up when they had decided something, and the deciding was already done, and the standing up was just the physical fact of it. I provided that document, she said. Her voice was clear. I found it in my husband's possession. She looked at Chair Ellison. I provided the original to the county attorney's office this morning. The room held what had just landed in it, the way the bridge held weight by distributing it, by not collapsing under it, by doing the quiet structural work that rooms and bridges and communities do when they are built well enough to take the load. Pruitt was on his feet. Barbara. Sit down, Harlan, Chair Ellison said. He sat down. She looked at the contract for a long moment, then at Curtis's assessment, then at Earl Marsh's notebook, which sat between them on the commission table, like a small, quiet fact about what it meant to love something long enough to document it. The chair is going to recommend, she said carefully, that item 7 be tabled pending referral to the county attorney for conflict of interest review. She looked down the row of commissioners. And I'm going to request that a recusal motion be filed regarding Commissioner Pruitt's participation in any bridge-related matters. A pause. All in favor. 8 hands, 8 out of 9. The 9th was Pruitt, who did not raise his hand, who was already looking at Meredith, and Meredith was not looking back. Pruitt resigned 12 days later. It was not a dramatic resignation. It was an email to the county commission citing personal reasons effective immediately. No statement, no public explanation. The county attorney's office had already opened a review. The state ethics board had been notified. What happened after that was a legal process that moved at legal speeds, and Cole paid attention to it the way you paid attention to weather, aware of it, not controlled by it. It was not his business to prosecute Harlan Pruitt. His business was the bridge. The SHPO determination arrived on a Thursday in July. Cole was on the bridge when his phone buzzed. He was 60 feet up on the main arch doing something meticulous with a wire brush and rust converter, and he'd promised himself he would not look at his phone while he was on the arch, because looking at your phone while you were 60 feet up on a riveted iron truss over a 40-meter gorge was how people became a cautionary tale. He looked at his phone. Cold Harbor Iron Bridge has been officially listed on the West Virginia State Historic Register. Demolition or material alteration is now subject to mandatory State Historic Preservation Office review and approval. He read it twice. He put the phone back in his pocket. He kept working, because the bridge still needed work. Because the listing was not the end of a thing, it was the formal beginning of the obligation to take care of it, which was different from a victory, which was better actually. A victory was finished. An obligation kept going. He came down at 5. Jean was waiting at the approach. She'd been showing up more lately. Not to help exactly. More to witness. Like she'd appointed herself the official observer of things being done correctly and intended to fulfill that appointment with full attendance. She looked at his face. It came through, she said. Yes. She nodded. She looked at the bridge. The late afternoon sun was hitting the iron the way it hit it in summer, warm gold on the rust red, the shadows of the upper cord falling in geometric patterns across the deck. It was beautiful in the way that useful things were beautiful. Not decorative. Real. Earl would have something obnoxious to say about this, she said. Like what? Like I told you she'd hold. She smiled. Not wide, just true. He would have said that, probably more than once. She held, Cole said. Jean looked at him. So did you. The work took the rest of the summer. Cole didn't rush it. Rushing was for things that had a deadline. This didn't have a deadline anymore. It had a future which was a different thing entirely. A future required patience. Required doing things right the first time because there wasn't going to be a second demolition notice to concentrate the mind. Burrell's store became a kind of supply depot. Cole would come in with a list and Burrell would have most of it already. Not because Cole had called ahead, because Burrell paid attention, and paying attention was how Burrell showed care, and Burrell had quietly decided to care about this project in the way that practical men cared about things by making sure the materials were there when they were needed. Curtis came out twice more to inspect Cole's work. He had opinions, many opinions. He delivered them with the brisk precision of a man who understood that opinions were most useful when they were specific. Cole listened to all of them, adjusted accordingly, changed what needed changing, held his ground on the three things where he was certain Curtis was wrong, which Curtis ultimately acknowledged with the grace of a man who respected being argued with correctly. Theodore Greer came out on a Saturday with his original photograph, The Young Woman Laughing Under the Arch, 1967. He wanted it back. But first, he wanted to stand on the deck and hold it up and compare the arch in the photograph to the arch above him. He stood there for a long time doing that. Then he put the photograph carefully back in its envelope and looked at Cole. "Same bridge," he said. "Same bridge," Cole said. Theodore nodded. She would have liked to know that. He tucked the envelope under his arm. She worried about things she loved, worried they wouldn't last. He started walking back toward the approach. I could never convince her that some things do. Cole watched him go. Atlas watched him go too. Then looked back at Cole with the settled patience of a dog who has understood something and is waiting for the human to catch up. September came soft and golden. The work was mostly done. The stabilization was complete, all of it, the floor beams, the lateral bracing, the surface treatment on the main arch. The iron was still red-orange. Cole hadn't changed that. The rust had been treated and stopped, but he'd left the color. The color was the bridge's own. It belonged to it. What he'd added was integrity, the structural kind, the kind you couldn't see but could trust. The afternoon he finished the last floor beam connection, he came down off the bridge and sat on his flat rock and stayed there for a long time. Atlas pressed against his side. Cole pulled out his folding knife, the same one he'd held on that first night, the one he'd touched to the iron and then put away because there was work to do first, because you couldn't put your name on something you hadn't earned the right to. He'd earned it now. He walked back to the bridge, to the main compression cord, to Walter Hargrove, 1923, to the name he'd found on a February morning that had recalibrated everything that followed. He stood next to it, touched it the way he'd touched it that first night, 2 fingers on the carved letters. Cold iron, 100 years of standing. He opened the knife, and below his grandfather's name, carefully, taking his time, making each letter true and clear and deep enough that they would still be legible long after he wasn't around to speak for them. Cole Hargrove. He closed the knife, stood back, looked at the 2 names, one above, one below, one from 1923, one from now, the same blood, the same thing somehow about needing to be part of something built correctly, about finding the thing that was worth staying for and deciding to stay. He heard boots on the deck. Jean. She came and stood beside him without being invited, which was how Jean always arrived, and which Cole had stopped thinking of as presumptuous about 4 months ago. She looked at the names. Earl's is on the other side, she said. I know. He'd want to be next to you. He's next to Walter, Cole said. That's better. Jean was quiet. She looked at the 2 names for a long moment. You know, she said, when Earl died, I thought the bridge would bother me, remind me, every time I looked at it. She put her hand on the iron below both names. But it doesn't. It does the opposite. She took her hand away. Some things carry people forward instead of just back. Cole looked at her. She looked like herself, like a woman who had been 72 years on the earth and had arrived through whatever combination of luck and loss and deliberate choice at something resembling peace. Not the absence of hard things, the presence of something that outlasted them. Thank you, he said. Not for any specific thing, for all of it. For the coffee at 6:30, and Earl's notebook, and the supplemental significance statement, and the night they crossed the bridge in the flood, and the 100 ordinary mornings she had showed up when she didn't have to, and done what she didn't have to, and been there in the way that some people were there fully, without reservation, without keeping score. Don't thank me, Jean said. I was invested. I know. Financially, she said. I want that money back. Cole laughed. Actually laughed. Which was, he noted this because it was notable, not something that had been happening frequently, or at all, since a while. And it felt like something returning rather than something new, like a structure being brought back to its original load-bearing capacity, not rebuilt, restored. Atlas looked up at both of them. His tail moved once slow and satisfied. Burl came at sunset. He didn't say anything when he got there. He walked out to the middle of the bridge the way he always walked, deliberate, no wasted movement, and stood at the center railing and looked down at the gorge. The river was low in September, silver and quiet, nothing like the roaring black water of the flood. 40 meters below, moving at its own pace, answering to its own schedule. Burl put his hands on the railing. My father, he said, would have had something to say about this. What would he have said? Cole asked. Burl thought about it. He would have said that the measure of a man wasn't what he built. It was what he kept standing. Cole looked at the gorge. That's a good measure, he said. He was a good man. Burl straightened, looked at the arch above them, at Walter Hargrove, 1923. So was yours. They stood there for a while, the three of them, Cole, Burl, Jean, who had come back from the approach and stood a few steps behind, like she understood this was a moment for a particular kind of quiet and was choosing to honor it by staying inside it. And Atlas, at Cole's left side, where Atlas always was. The sun was going down behind the west ridge. It turned the iron gold, not the rust orange of weathered metal. Something different, something the light was doing with the treated surface and the angle of September and the way this gorge oriented itself to the west. The bridge glowed, just for a few minutes, just while the sun was at that exact angle. The iron, all 90 meters of it, the arches and the chords and the verticals, and the 40-year-old name of a man who had come back to check on it, and the 100-year-old name of a man who had built it, and the name Cole had just added, still fresh, still sharp at the edges, all of it caught the light and held it. The way iron holds things, the way some things do. Cole put his hand on Atlas's back. The dog leaned into it. The dog tags and the aluminum tag clicked softly together in the September breeze. Below them, Cold Harbor River moved. Above them, the iron held. And in the gorge, in the last light, in the quiet that belonged to things that had lasted long enough to stop explaining themselves, the bridge stood exactly as it had always stood, which was not the same as nothing having changed. Everything had changed. But the bridge was still there. And sometimes if you were paying attention, if you came back to the right place at the right time, with a dog and an empty notebook and no better ideas, you found that the thing had been waiting, not for rescue, not for a hero, just for someone willing to stay.